Welcome to the Family Front. My name is Hannah Bruck, and I work at the Texas Public Policy Foundation to make Texas the best place to build families and marriages. Today, we're talking about a question that sits quietly underneath a lot of cultural debates, but is deeply personal for many young people. How do we come to understand who we are, and what happens when that understanding is shaped by the institutions and messages around us? Joining us today is Soren Aldaco. Soren's voice has become a part of the broader legal and cultural conversation about identity, medicine, and the experience of detransitioners. But at its core, the story she tells is a human story, one about adolescence, belonging, and the search for stability and truth. Soren, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Hannah.
It's wonderful that you're with us. So just to start at the beginning, I'd like to maybe give you the opportunity to talk through your experience and perspective at a very high level. What are kind of some key moments that we can identify and then go further into as to kind of moments in your life that are part of this conversation?
For sure. So starting very young, I was on my own. I was raised by a single mom. Dad wasn't in the picture, and I had lots of grandparents, but it's still tough not to have a dad. And that was true until about 4 or 5. My mom met my stepdad. He became disabled shortly after, and we ended up moving out and away from all of my grandparents. So my mom was working all the time. Dad was in bed, drugged out of his mind at the end of the opioid crisis, and I was on my devices a lot. I was on my iPod Touch, my handheld Nintendos, and the internet in a way ended up raising me. And while I was on the internet, I unfortunately was groomed by adults, and through feeling a lot of shame in my body from that experience, I came to identify as trans when I saw other girls with similar experiences coming forth with that proclamation that they felt like a boy trapped in a girl's body. And it remained a role play identity for me largely from ages 11 to 15. And at age 15, I met my dad for the first time, my biological father. And that was huge. But I did lose my mind a little bit, ended up going to an inpatient facility after having a fight with my stepdad. And while inpatient, a psychiatrist coerced me to come out to him as trans and told my family that all my problems were related to my identification as transgender. So it became very real at that point, and I started going to a support group with my biological father and stepmother, and it was in that support group that I met a nurse practitioner who prescribed me hormones at 17. I started going to a therapist who would give me a letter for a mastectomy, and I'd have that mastectomy at 19, and then within 6 months of the mastectomy, I would detransition in 2022. I'm 23, just shy of 24 today, so it's been a few years since then, but I think that that's the best TLDR.
That's certainly quite a lot. I want to narrow our focus maybe a little bit initially to kind of your years as a teenager. Yeah. And I know that you mentioned a lot with the influence of kind of the internet and that digital environment. So maybe could you talk us through kind of what you were experiencing personally, emotionally, and then maybe on a factual level, things that you were encountering that made it more or less believable when you were questioning your identity and the role that the internet played in that?
Yeah, so a lot of my time spent on the internet during that period was in chat rooms, on art forums, and anybody who's ever done anything with art, even if they're not in those particular spaces, knows what a creative thing it is generally, right? It's kind of a common knowledge. And in online spaces especially, where you're not in your body, I think the line between fantasy and reality gets blurred even more than usual. And that's where I fell, was I was creating all sorts of original characters. I was finding belonging for some of the first times in my life. And when I had a little girlfriend online. We would role play and draw art together, and we'd have characters that were friends even. And she came out to me as trans. I remember she had drawn this picture of herself where she had a blue head and a pink body to really emphasize that she had like a boy's brain and a girl's frame. And I think that I was playing all these sports. I was a tomboy. My softball coach called me Dirt Baby. And I didn't want to grow into what I thought a woman was. So being able to be this boyish person forever, that I think wasn't maybe how I was thinking about at the time, but it was what was attractive to me. So online, I was hearing a lot of that boy trapped in a girl's body rhetoric that I mentioned before. And I think just generally, I touched on it briefly earlier, the predatory nature of a lot of adults who are online interacting with children. Back then, it was on these chat rooms and forums. Today it might be on Roblox, right? I think that was maybe a centerpiece for me, because something that was innocent, art, was very easily twisted into something that I think took advantage of a lot of the shame I was feeling about my body during puberty.
Yeah. And I want to kind of expand out into this like question of narrative, because you mentioned something that was so interesting, I think, about like the very nature of a creative space, which is that it suspends reality in some form or fashion. And so I would love to hear your perspective on maybe the ways in which there are narratives in the backgrounds that shape these digital spaces, and maybe your perspective on how much more powerful narratives can be to young people as opposed to maybe data and facts, or where you see that role complementing one another.
Yeah, and I think that idea of data and facts almost being in opposition to narrative is a really important one to focus on, especially in the age of social media, where algorithms are driving content to young people, whether it's on, Instagram or it's on TikTok, that take advantage of the fact that while young people can sort through information logically, their ability to emotionally regulate is next to none. And I think for me, that messaging that I needed to find myself as if I wasn't already myself was maybe right there at the forefront of the development of this identity. And I see this in a number of ways. I mean, the obsession with diagnosis today, whether that's, getting a gender dysphoria diagnosis so you can transition, or an autism diagnosis so you just understand yourself and everything you've been for the past 40 years at times. I think that idea that something was wrong with me, when in fact I was experiencing something relatively normal, the soul searching that identity formation is in adolescence, that was probably the number one thing that I think about now.
Yeah. And then I guess to think about the way that that was capitalized on in your experience throughout the different kind of institutions of society, whether it be kind of that community or even the capacity where it allowed for you to take the step towards medical transitioning. What kind of feeding into that narrative did you see at maybe the higher, more institutional level that worries you in thinking about the way that young people perceive their identity today?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to something I just mentioned, right? That diagnostic obsession. I think there's definitely that message that there's a medication for everything. And we've all been watching TV and seen the prescription commercials where everybody's happy, and it's because they have this medication for this problem they have. And I saw that in my stepfather growing up with his back injury and the opioids he was taking. I saw that in my own life. I was medicalized for ADHD at age 7. I was put on prescription stimulants for that. It was apparent to me from a young age, both culturally and in my own medical background, that there was this quick fix almost, which when it came to transgender identity, I had these feelings, as I mentioned, are developmentally normal, that they go away with time. They're unstable in that sense, that they're not going to last forever. And yet I felt like I had to have this solution that was a little more permanent, a little more grounded, that was more attractive than time.
And on the other side of that, I want to talk about when you started thinking about the decision to detransition. At what point did kind of doubts about your experience thus far begin to surface? And what was maybe kind of like the catalyst for that?
I think what's interesting is actually talking about it with you now. It's more apparent to me than ever that I started to learn about the human condition and what it was actually meant to be human, right? That our emotions do tend to fade if we don't play into them a lot, or that there's the idea, and this is so simple, right, that there are two sexes, that every other primate has two sexes, every other mammal has two sexes. I took some biological anthropology classes that taught me these things. I took some cultural anthropology, sociology, psychology. I learned about what we actually understood about being human. And I think that's where that facts part you mentioned came into play, where I realized, oh, whoa, everything emotional that I'd gotten from the internet that sounded nice is actually to some degree, maybe not even an indirect contradiction to what the truth is, but in fact almost twists the truth into something that's a little more palatable. So as I was taking on all this information and just witnessing the consequences of those medical interventions in particular, and even the way that the social interventions had divorced me from my family, that was the moment it really dawned on me that, okay, there was a better way to live, that I could actually forge being that role model that I was missing growing up. I could be that woman that little girls could look up to for what they could be.
That's so powerful. I would love to also kind of touch on that emotional and social element. When you made this decision, what were the kind of difficulties that you faced, maybe emotionally, physically, socially, and then what kind of support existed for you? You talked about maybe being a role model for other young girls, which is so important. Did you have role models, or what was created around you to kind of help that process?
It's interesting because looking back, I did have role models at different points in my life, but because of that obsession with diagnostics and belonging, I thought that my role models needed to be this very narrow thing, that they couldn't be, I couldn't transfer traits about people and make them my own. So like looking at my softball coach, who is a little, she was fiery and sassy and a little sarcastic. She didn't look like me because everything I'd been taught about belonging online was surface level. When we know from like when our parents were growing up that actually it's a lot deeper than that. It's about the kind of person you are on the inside. And I think that goes back to that way that rhetoric has been twisted, right? It's all about who you are on the inside now and never coming to peace with the outside. But I think there's balance in between those two things that just a lot of the conversation is missing. So when it came to becoming that kind of role model, I think I started to see myself in people I had never really imagined I would. Even in looking at my mom or my stepmom, I thought, okay, they're women. They don't feel like they're not women, but they're also not this like princess this picture of a princess I'd had in my head either. They were women who maybe had long hair and had a purse, but they didn't act like a caricature in the way that I think I had internalized from my time on the internet, and especially in those pornographic spaces. And so I, over time, really think that I found in becoming that role model, I just kind of dug into that expressing these larger life lessons, expressing the more spiritual lessons, honestly, that maybe I had presented to me, but that I didn't know how to decipher because of the information spaces I was in.
And on the outset of kind of all of this, now kind of fast forwarding to today, what has your experience been like talking about your perspective on these issues and the way in which your life has changed throughout these different phases?
I think it's on one side therapeutic and on the other side dutiful, because I feel like in order to really grasp a lot of the insights that led me out of the trans identity and allowed me to feel comfortable enough to detransition, to leave it behind and admit I was wrong, I had to create these bridges between what I had known all throughout my life and what reality actually was. And so a lot of this communication that I'm doing now, I think, is identifying those bridges explicitly, being like, yeah, you don't have people that look like you maybe, but can you relate to those people on a character level? Yeah, maybe in the context of my being an academic, right? I'm in grad school. I'm in a classroom where I'm instructing and helping to instruct undergrads. I'm thinking, okay, maybe you're not understanding where you're going to be doing a lit report on this very specific topic, but what are you learning from this experience that you can take into other areas of life or apply to your personal life? That transfer, I think, is huge. And that's what I think a lot of my expression and perspective sharing today is just naming that transfer explicitly.
Yeah. And I love the way that you frame kind of like character as a core center of the way that people visualize those that they want to look up to and those that they want to emulate, and how that is more central than kind of this, like you said, surface level assessment. I love to talk about kind of this question of identity in the context of relationships between people. And I'd love to get your opinion on the ways in which family structures or shifts in family structures and stability may affect a young person's sense of personal identity. What do you think maybe could be an outcome of a shifting family dynamic?
Well, importantly, when we're growing up, we develop our sense of self through what we see in other people. Role models, as we've talked about, are central to identity development. So when you don't have near others, when you don't have innocent intimacy, right? Whether that's with your mom or your siblings or even your father, that I think can lead to some disruption in that healthy identity process. And we're seeing that in the shifting family roles, because it's not just that mom's out of the home, like neither parent is in the home in a lot of cases. Children and the rearing of children in many ways are being offloaded to strangers. And I think that how can you expect someone to know where they're from and to feel that inherent sense of belonging when they're so far removed and they spend the majority of their days away from those that they came from? That's the biggest part to me.
Yeah. And I guess maybe anecdotally then, as you've kind of restructured and reformatted and come back to a sense of identity, how has that affected kind of your personal sense of familial relationships?
My experience was really interesting to start with what I was going through when I was in the identity, because I didn't know my dad, right? So much of my distress came from this tension with my stepfather and my mom working all the time. And when I met my biological father for the first time and my stepmom too, and they were willing to affirm my trans identity, that I think that going full frontal into these people who were strangers to me, who did not understand my context, who didn't know how to then contextualize the mental health crisis I was going through, it felt good, but it was hollow. And so as I've healed, my relationship with them is quite strained, but my relationship with my mom and my stepdad and my grandma and all these people who watched me growing up, who didn't reject me when I was complex, maybe had a little bit of discomfort. They struggled to know what to do with that complexity, as many humans do. But to be able to have a good relationship with them today, I think has come from honestly just having a lot of humility myself, like having conversations with them. For example, one Christmas, I wrote them a song that was just called Thank You. And it was like, thank you for always staying when you had every right to leave. And this idea that, especially in a culture where we encourage people to liberate themselves from toxic situations, that deeper level of commitment, that innocent intimacy where they were just present, I think that is something I really value today, and something that I think I've grown to really appreciate in this experience.
I love the way that you characterize that innocent intimacy. I think that is so sweet, and I think that that's very appropriate. What do you think that maybe, especially in the context of a parent that's trying to do right by their child, and maybe is trying to stay informed, what do you think most parents kind of get wrong when addressing this question of gender identity or identity in general with their children?
I think parents, and trying to help their kids as much as possible, maybe even looking back to their own negative experiences in the past, they tend to be a little forward. And to clarify what I mean by that, I think there's this shift in parenting as well, where we went from general guidance to either hands off, I'm not going to give my kids any guidance, they're little people who it's their lives, right? Or you're doing this kind of concerted cultivation where you're figuring out all the little details, making sure your kids have the perfect amount of risk, and you're forcing them to do tasks, but in this very controlled manner, and you're coordinating all their extracurriculars and so on, right? And I think that either of those approaches really fails to meet what kids need, which is they need boundaries within which to fail. They need to break their arm because they climbed a tree that they couldn't climb. Because you know what? Next time they're not going to climb that tree. They're going to realize what risk is. And that creates strong adults. But it's what I'm really seeing a lot of parents get wrong in this arena, is either they're letting their kids guide the way and start these hormones and these processes and even the social transitions very young, or they're trying to direct everything for their kids when what their kids are doing is they're trying to individuate.
Yeah. And I heard it kind of something that is related to this recently, where it was kind of this role of parenthood as an act of like constantly getting to know your child. So instead of just being like, oh, and here's the structure and you exist in the structure, it's like, well, on an individual level, what do I know about the person that my child is becoming, and what things might be well suited? What boundaries can I create that are well suited to that? And so I think that you had a really helpful dimension to kind of that responsibility of parents to be introspective about the way that they build relationships with their children. I would love to kind of build out that question of responsibility, because we have kind of the institution of the family, which the parents operate in. What kind of responsibilities do you think other institutions in society have and ought to have when kind of cultivating spaces for children as they come up and have these questions?
Yeah, and I'll answer that in just a moment. I wanted to comment briefly when you talked about parenthood as this like constant duty to get to know your child. I also heard it put specifically for the mother is that motherhood is this challenge to let go over time, right? Like you start with the child as part of you and then attached to you, relying on you. And over time, you have to kind of allow your child to go to school or to start hanging out with friends after school or to move out. And that I think is those two processes are very related. But as for other institutions, I immediately think of two. I think of the academic institutions, right? When we have children leave the nest, as I just mentioned, to be able to trust that they're going to somewhere where, yeah, there's some degree of interpersonal, professional development, but it's not introducing this whole new way of life that actually effectively removes children from this context they've had for 18 plus years. That's a huge one that we're seeing a lot of struggle with right now is what is the purpose of higher ed and what should our academic curriculum look like to support that? And then, of course, in this issue of gender specifically, I'm thinking about the institution of medicine. And, first and foremost, doctors have the duty to do no harm. But additionally, I think, doctors serve as important gatekeepers because if we didn't have doctors and we could prescribe ourselves all kinds of medications, I mean, we're seeing the abuses happen with doctors, right? Like I've mentioned throughout this conversation, the opioid crisis. We've seen doctors go awry. And so imagine if your average person could just choose whatever drugs they want, if those commercials were marketed towards you and not your doctor through you. I think that's what transgender medicine has come out of, is that consumer culture of medicine. And doctors, honestly, they have the duty to say no sometimes. They have the duty to listen to their patients. But I see validation and affirmation as two different things, and that distinction being very important to this issue, because a doctor can say, yeah, you're describing a real pain to me. I believe you that you're struggling. And they don't have to do exactly what the patient is telling them to do. Because again, why else have doctors?
Right. Yeah. They're supposed to feed into kind of, again, at a personal level, what would be best based on the information that they can receive about the individual. Yeah.
It's similar to parenting in a lot of ways, where it's like you're there to be like, yeah, I'm here for you, but also you can't stay out until 2 a.m. You're 14.
Right. There have to be boundaries set into place. And I love how you painted motherhood as this continuous act of letting go. I think that is so important. I would love to downshift kind of into a little bit more of kind of a personal side of things and talk about the ways in which all of this information coming together has affected kind of your perspective on relationships, belonging, and then the future. So from kind of the beginning of when you were young and asking a lot of the questions to now when you're kind of on the other side of thinking through them pretty thoroughly, how has that kind of shaped your perspective on these different experiences and then also hope looking towards the future?
Yeah, I think relationships, starting with the family, and now I'm married. I was married on the 1st of this year. It's been a core issue in my life, and that's fundamentally human, right? That's not unique to me. Humans are social, and some of those earliest experiences with love, right? My grandparents who I lived with, I'm so grateful I had those close connections growing up, because I think it buffered me against a lot of the adversity that I would face later in life and enabled me to be resilient. And even though my struggles with my mom and my stepdad, they were real and they affected, my going through the trans identity and my even some of the struggles I have in adulthood today, to be able to look back on it, as I mentioned earlier, with humility, I think has really equipped me to be in my marriage now, where I'm seeing a really imperfect human before me and I'm being exposed for being really imperfect, and to be able to stay anyways, as I mentioned, as my family did for me in the trans identity, to be able to continue to be present and to continue showing up. I think that is one of the things I'm most grateful for, because throughout the trans identity, I had some really turbulent experiences with relationships too. I transitioned and detransitioned alongside a woman who I was in a committed relationship with for 5 years, and that ended pretty violently. And I think the way I tried to approach a relationship then, with compassion, without boundaries, was toxic, right? Allie Beth Stuckey talks about toxic empathy. That's something that I really resonate with in my experience, because even, that relationship with my dad and my stepmom that I mentioned, I don't really have a good one with them today. That was rooted in toxic empathy as well, this lack of boundaries. So to be able to have hard boundaries, to be able to have boundaries and still in the spirit of marriage, be there anyways, be like, yo, this is not the conversation I want to be having right now, but I'm going to sit right here. I'm not going to walk out the door. I'm not going to divorce you. That's not even an option that's on the table. I'm just really grateful to have learned from those experiences and to do it so young. Like, I'm very happy in my marriage. And like I said, I'm only 23.
Yeah, I love the way that you describe that. And I really appreciate the kind of obvious introspection kind of you put into that, just in the way that you described that, even though this may not be the most comfortable moment, it's still a commitment that requires, conversation and two people coming together and humbling themselves so as to create something, a product, an institution that is bigger than both of them.
Yeah.
I would love to hear kind of your reflections on how your view of marriage as an institution kind of changed throughout the years. Was this always something that you thought positively of, or how might that have shifted?
Yeah, I've had a complex relationship with marriage just all throughout. I mean, seeing my mom be single for the first few years of my life and then get into marriage very quickly to support my stepdad who is disabled, that was all really confusing to me. I had seen some strong marriages, like my mom's mom and her husband. They're one of the model relationships in my life, frankly. And even, as an adult, seeing my biological father's dad and his wife and their relationship, it's beautiful too. So I've known there were good marriages out there. I was legally married to another woman, as I mentioned, when I was in transition, and that was very brief. It was 6 months in the middle of our larger relationship. And I think at the time there was that sense of commitment, but it was for legal benefits. It was for all intents and purposes a civil partnership to allow her to be on hormones as a minor. It was something that, in hindsight, I have a hard time even categorizing as a marriage at all, especially when I compare it today to this legal partnership with my husband, but also this deeper spiritual commitment. We are two halves of the same person. We are one person. And I think that has enabled us to show up in those hard times. Because when you have this idea that you could leave, I'd seen this LinkedIn post this week. I actually thought of you. I thought you might find it interesting, where there was this woman who, her husband was a stay-at-home dad for all their kids, and they just had another kid. And she told him, I want you to go out and get a job because I want you to be able to leave. I want you to be able to leave me. And I remember thinking, like, what? Like, you want him to be able to leave you? Because her idea was, well, I get to choose him every day. I'm the breadwinner. I get to choose him every day. He doesn't get to choose me every day. And, my husband and I reflected on this post, and we were like, no, us deciding to stay in a marriage together, to be interdependent, does not mean that we don't choose each other every day. Because as I mentioned before, choosing each other means showing up with patience, to not be proud, to be patient and kind, not proud, you get what I mean. And that, I get so emotional even talking about it, because I mean, that's what I view marriage as now, is I've made that commitment to an individual who I know is a good person at his core, I'm gonna be imperfect some days, he's gonna be imperfect some days. And I think the way I shifted from scary to I want this, but it's for benefits, to no, it's love, it's Christ-like love, it's enduring. That's, I think, that's been big for me as a young adult, for sure.
I heard marriage described recently, and it was kind of like the difference in how most young people perceive marriage to what it actually is, or how some people perceive marriage. And it was like marriage as a legal contract versus marriage as a spiritual covenant.
Yeah.
And one of those can be broken way easier and way more without like thought than the other. I would love to hear your perspective on kind of the marriage crisis as it is right now. You don't see kind of the same amount of young people getting married. People are more critical of the institution. What are your reactions to that, or your thoughts on kind of that as it presents with young people today?
You've made a great point, I think, to start with. This idea that there are two separate spheres of marriage is part of what has made it so confusing for young people, in my opinion. Because when your focus is on this legal contract, as you mentioned, it can be broken very easily. It's almost hollow without that spiritual covenant as well. Because what keeps you in those hard moments if you can just go get a divorce, if not for trying to follow in the footsteps of Christ? And so for me, I definitely think that all the attempts I made at having relationships before, whether that was, my marriage or with my family, if I could see it as this surface level, just like agreement to be buddies or agreement to be, to live with one another, I think that just didn't have the same satisfaction, frankly, because there wasn't this connection to my deeper purpose. And human beings, regardless of whether they're religious or even Christian, like they're always going to be seeking to fill that hole. They're always going to be seeking for what does life mean and what is my deeper purpose going to be. That's just, I think, inherent to us.
Yeah. And it is such a unique institution where it's like your purpose insofar as, especially in kind of a religious aspect, kind of like serving a higher good over yourself, but particularly it's you serving another person.
Yeah.
And it's them serving you, and it's you serving each other every
Precisely.
day, so as to mirror that service that you receive and then offer up. I would love to kind of move into a couple closing thoughts from you. What would you say to the young person that is maybe listening to this or thinking about these things and is experiencing doubts or distress or questions about identity in a similar way to maybe how you did?
Yeah, I would say give yourself time. It's okay to have doubts and questions. You don't have to diagnose those right now. You don't have to figure it out in this moment. Because in fact, when you try and force a particular interpretation of a situation, you're going to close yourself off to maybe some really meaningful sources of information and insights that you actually need to make the best decision possible.
And then also, what would you kind of offer as encouragement to parents who are thinking through the enormous task of answering these questions and handling the weight of these things? And what would you kind of say to them as they grapple with that?
I think it'd be very similar to what I've told the kids, which is take your time. It feels urgent because these are very costly interventions, the medical ones especially, but it's almost like you can go at it really hard and it can backfire at you just as hard. That doesn't mean sit on it forever. It doesn't mean don't set those precious boundaries that Hannah and I have been talking about, but be discerning in it. Know when is the right moment to act and speak and when is the right moment to sit back and listen, because it's going to be that balance in which you find the strength, I think, to not only endure the situation that you're facing, but also to come out of it with, as I mentioned to the young people, a solution that's actually in your higher good.
Well, Soren, thank you so much for sharing your story and your perspective with us and for bringing such humanity to an issue that I think is so easily reduced to a talking point or a headline. I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Hannah Bruck. Thank you for joining us. Let's bring family to the front.